The pack elders laughed when they handed her the iron key. The eastern wing, the abandoned chamber. It was the coldest room in the entire keep, a place where the hearth hadn't held a fire in 11 years. They expected her to freeze. They expected her to crawl back and beg the false Luna for a single blanket. They expected the wolfless Omega to finally learn her place. But Ivy did not cry. When the heavy oak door locked behind her, she didn't collapse on the freezing stone floor. Instead, she took a breath. Her hands were numb, her simple linen dress offering no protection against the biting winter draft. But her mind was sharp. She walked to the shattered window and used her torn wedding veil to seal the cracks. She knelt before the dead hearth, her fingers scraping against the stone as she struck the ancient flint. One spark, then another. By midnight, the coldest room in the keep was glowing with a steady, golden warmth. She sat by the fire, quietly organizing the scattered royal land deeds she had found in the dust, the very documents the corrupt council thought she couldn't read. She didn't know someone was watching. Alpha King Ronin stood in the shadowed corridor, his royal guards waiting in stunned silence. He had come to see the broken girl the council had condemned. But as the scent of pine smoke and lavender drifted under the heavy door, his inner wolf let out a low, unexpected rumble. He pushed the door open. Ivy didn't flinch. She didn't kneel. She simply looked up from the documents, her eyes meeting the most ruthless ruler in the kingdom. "The room is cold, my king," she said quietly, her voice perfectly steady. "But I have learned to build my own warmth." Ronin stared at her, the mate bond slamming into his chest like a physical blow. The council thought they had buried a worthless Omega. Instead, they had just awakened the true queen of the pack. The silence in the eastern chamber stretched, heavy and charged. The fire crackled in the hearth, throwing warm amber light across the uneven stone walls. Ronin did not move from the doorway. His winter blue eyes remained locked on the woman sitting on the floor. She wore a simple gray wool dress, patched at the hem, and a torn linen cloak that offered almost no insulation against the mountain winter. Yet her posture was impeccable. Her spine was straight, her chin level. She did not bear the scent of fear. Instead, the air around her was thick with the scent of pine smoke, old paper, and a faint, crisp note of frost-kissed mint. It was a scent that made Ronin's blood hum. His inner wolf, usually a disciplined, silent force born of years on the battlefield, was pacing restlessly against his ribs. Mate. The word echoed in his mind, sharp and absolute. But Ronin was a king before he was a wolf. He forced his breathing to slow, his expression smoothing into the contained, impenetrable mask that had kept the Ashenvale Council in line for a decade. He stepped fully into the room, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him. The royal guards remained outside. "Who holds the key to this wing?" Ronin asked. His voice was low, carrying the quiet resonance of a man who never had to shout to be obeyed. "Lord Harwick," Ivy answered, her hazel eyes meeting his without a tremor. "And Lord Cedric. They informed me that an unmarked Omega requires a period of isolation to properly appreciate the generosity of the pack." Ronin's jaw tightened. "Generosity. A polite word for a prison," Ivy noted dryly. She turned her attention back to the parchment spread across the floor. She had meticulously arranged the documents in rows, using smooth, dark stones she had gathered from the window ledge to weight the corners. "It's the draft." Ronin walked closer, his tall, broad-shouldered frame casting a long shadow over her makeshift workspace. He looked down. He expected to see a terrified girl trying to distract herself with meaningless scribbles. Instead, he saw royal land deeds, You read the council's ledgers, he stated. It was not a question. I was my father's ledger keeper in the Caldwell holding before I was sold to your court, Ivy said. Her hands, though slightly red from the cold, moved with careful precision as she aligned a secondary document next to a primary deed. People often assume that because I do not possess a wolf, I also do not possess a mind. I have found it is a very useful assumption. Something shifted in Ronin's chest. Not pity. Pity was an insult to a woman like this. It was profound, quiet respect. He knelt beside her, the dark leather of his riding armor creaking slightly. He was close enough now that he could see the bandage wrapped around her right palm, a fresh injury from the rough stone stairs of the tower. He did not reach for her hand. He knew better than to corner a survivor. Instead, he looked at the parchment her finger was resting on. Look here, Ivy said, her tone shifting seamlessly from a prisoner addressing a king to a scholar addressing a colleague. She did not seem intimidated by his proximity. The land transfer for the Western Border Territories. It was filed 3 days before the harvest moon. I signed that transfer, Ronin said. It was standard reallocation for the winter defenses. You signed the summary, Ivy corrected, sliding a smooth stone to reveal the bottom edge of the original deed. But you did not sign the addendum. This flourish here, the double loop on the H, that is not standard clerk notation. Ronin's eyes narrowed. He recognized the ink stroke immediately. Harwick, Ronin murmured, the temperature in the room seeming to drop despite the fire. Lord Harwick, Ivy confirmed. He has been quietly redirecting the yield from 3 separate border territories into private holding accounts. When Cedric arranged for me to be brought here, it wasn't just to secure the Caldwell lands. It was to ensure that the one person who knew how my father kept his ledgers was locked in a room where she would freeze before she could speak. She looked up at him, the firelight catching the golden strands of her braided hair. They gave me the coldest room, my king. They simply forgot to check if I knew how to start a fire. Ronin stared at her. The mate bond pulled at him again, fierce and demanding. He wanted to pull her up from the cold floor. He wanted to drape his fur-lined cloak over her shoulders and carry her to the royal wing. He wanted to strip Harwick of his rank before dawn. But he looked at the steady, unbroken dignity in her hazel eyes, and he understood something crucial. She was not asking to be saved. She was offering him the truth, weaponized and perfectly organized under smooth river stones. If he treated her like a fragile omega now, he would be no better than the council who locked her in here. The room is inadequate, Ronin said quietly. I will have you moved to the southern wing. No. The word was soft, but it held the weight of iron. Ronin paused. No one said no to the king of Ashenvale. I built the warmth in this room, Ivy said, her gaze unwavering. I sealed the window. I struck the flint. If I leave now, they will believe they successfully broke me out of it. I will stay here until the council session tomorrow, and when I walk out of this door, it will not be as a refugee fleeing the cold. It will be as the woman who holds their ruin. Ronin's breath hitched. A slow, dark sense of pride unfurled in his chest. His wolf settled, vibrating with approval. Queen. Very well, Ronin said softly. You keep the room. Before Ivy could reply, the heavy sound of booted footsteps echoed from the stone corridor outside. The metallic clink of a council guard's armor signaled an approach. Someone was coming to check on the prisoner. Ivy's hands went still over the ledgers. Ronin stood up seamlessly, his presence instantly shifting from quiet observer to a lethal shadow. "That is Harwick's heavy tread," he said, his voice dropping to a barely audible whisper. He stepped back into the dark alcove near the door, completely concealed by the deep shadows of the stone architecture. His blue eyes met hers from the dark. "Let him speak," Ronin ordered softly, the command carrying a dangerous edge. "Let him think you are alone and defeated. Let us hear what the corrupt elder says when he thinks the king is not listening." The heavy iron lock clicked, and the oak door swung inward. Lord Harwick stood in the doorway, wrapped in a thick fur mantle that signified his high seat on the council. He paused, his pale eyes sweeping the room, clearly surprised by the golden light of the fire. "You found the flint," Harwick said, his voice laced with patronizing amusement. "How resourceful for a wolfless Omega. Cedric told me you were completely helpless. It seems you possess at least the survival instincts of a common servant." Ivy did not stand. She remained seated on the stone floor, her gray wool dress neatly arranged around her. She picked up one of the smooth window ledge stones and placed it deliberately over the signature on a land deed. "Survival is merely a matter of preparation, Lord Harwick," Ivy said, not looking up. "Though I suppose preparation is something you understand intimately. It takes a great deal of it to forge 3 separate territorial transfers under the king's nose." Harwick's amused smile vanished. He stepped into the room, kicking the door shut behind him. In the darkest alcove of the chamber, Ronin stood perfectly still. His breath was shallow, his presence entirely masked by years of battlefield discipline. But his winter blue eyes tracked Harwick like a predator watching a dying stag. "You have a sharp tongue for a woman who has nothing," Harwick sneered, walking toward her. "You think those ledgers matter? You think anyone in the royal court will listen to a rejected, unmarked bride? Tomorrow at the council session, you will sign the final consent decrees, transferring the Caldwell holding to Cedric." "And if I refuse?" Ivy asked, her voice calm, though her fingers tightened around the smooth stone in her lap. "If you refuse, I will have the council declare you mentally unfit," Harwick replied smoothly. "You will be locked in the underground cells, not this tower. The king is a soldier, my dear, a war alpha. He swings swords and signs the papers I place in front of him. He does not care about the fate of an Omega. He trusts his council." In the shadows, the temperature seemed to plummet. The alpha aura radiating from Ronin was so dense, so terrifyingly heavy, that the flames in the hearth actually flickered and bowed low. Harwick shivered, pulling his fur mantle tighter. "Curse this draft," he muttered, completely unaware of the lethal force standing 10 feet away from him. He looked down at Ivy one last time. "Tomorrow, you will kneel before the court, and you will sign. If you do, I will ensure Cedric keeps you reasonably comfortable. Do not test my patience." Harwick turned and walked out, the heavy door slamming and locking behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. The fire slowly recovered its height. Ronin stepped out of the shadows. The controlled, impenetrable mask of the king was gone. In its place was the raw, unrestrained fury of a betrayed alpha. His jaw was locked, his chest rising and falling heavily. Harwick had not just insulted the woman sitting on the floor. He had mocked the crown. But as Ronin looked down at Ivy, his fury abruptly shattered. Ivy was still sitting upright, her chin level, but the bandage on her right palm was soaked through. She had gripped the smooth stone so hard during Harwick's threats that the fresh wound from the tower stairs had reopened. The faint metallic scent of her blood hit Ronin's senses, snapping the mate bond tight across his chest. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and dropped to one knee in front of her. He didn't ask for permission. He reached out, his large, calloused hands gently taking her trembling right hand. His touch was warm, impossibly steady, and held a reverence that made Ivy's breath catch in her throat. "He thinks I am blind," Ronin said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through the stone floor. He looked from her bleeding hand up to her hazel eyes. "He thinks you are we." Ivy looked at the Alpha King, feeling the strange, quiet anchor of his wolf settling against her own silent spirit. "He is wrong about both of us." Ronin's thumb brushed lightly over her uninjured wrist, a protective gesture that was completely instinctual. "Tomorrow, you will not kneel before the court, Ivy. Tomorrow, you will take that ledger, and you will break his world apart. And I will stand behind you while you do it." The council chamber of Ashenvale Keep smelled of aged wood, tallow candles, and the heavy musk of alpha dominance. 12-pack elders sat around the massive circular oak table, their fur-lined mantles draped over their chairs. At the head of the room, elevated on a dais of black marble, sat Alpha King Ronin. He wore his formal black surcoat, his expression a mask of cold, impenetrable authority. Lord Cedric stood near the center of the room, looking every bit the aggrieved nobleman. Harwick sat at his right hand, exuding the comfortable confidence of a man who had rigged the game long before it started. "The matter of the Caldwell holding," Harwick announced to the chamber, his voice echoing off the stone pillars. "Lord Cedric's bride has proven unstable. Lacking a wolf, her mind has fractured under the weight of pack integration. For her own safety, she must sign the administrative transfer of her lands to her husband, allowing her to be quietly sequestered in the Eastern Tower." A murmur of agreement rippled through the elders. It was a neat, polite lie. At the back of the hall, the heavy, iron-bound doors groaned open. The murmurs died instantly. Every eye in the chamber turned. Ivy walked in. She did not look like a broken, unstable Omega. She wore the same plain gray wool dress, the bandage still stark white against her right palm. She had no fine jewelry, no luminous crown, no pack colors. But she carried herself with an architectural stillness, her spine perfectly straight, her chin level. In her arms, she held a heavy stack of leather-bound ledgers, a smooth river stone resting on top. Ronin's hands tightened on the carved armrests of his chair. Even from across the vast hall, his wolf felt the steady, unflinching rhythm of her heartbeat. She was terrified. He could smell the faint metallic spike of adrenaline beneath her scent of pine and mint, but she refused to let it break her. She walked down the center aisle, the silence in the room so absolute that only the soft rustle of her dress could be heard. She stopped at the edge of the central table, standing directly across from Harwick and Cedric. Cedric frowned, his arrogant mask slipping for a fraction of a second. She was supposed to be shivering. She was supposed to be begging. "Ivy," Harwick said, his voice dropping into a tone of false, sickening pity. "You should not be standing. The guards were supposed to help you to your knees. Kneel, child, and sign the parchment. We can put an end to your distress." He pushed a fresh piece of parchment and an inkwell toward the edge of the table. Ivy looked at the parchment. Then she looked at Cedric, and finally, her hazel eyes locked onto Harwick. She did not kneel. Slowly, deliberately, she set her stack of ledgers onto the center of the council table. The heavy leather bindings hit the wood with a solid thud. She placed the smooth window ledge stone right on top of Harwick's blank parchment. I will not kneel to a thief, Ivy said, her voice ringing out clear and cold in the cavernous hall. Several elders gasped. Cedric stepped forward, his eyes flashing with forced alpha rage. How dare you speak to an elder? I am not speaking to an elder, Ivy interrupted, her gaze never leaving Harwick's pale face. I am speaking to the man who has been embezzling from the king's winter borders for 3 years. She slid the top ledger open, revealing the heavily annotated land deed. The temperature in the room plummeted. Ronin leaned forward slowly from his throne, the dangerous, predatory grace of the Alpha King finally stirring. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the council chamber. Lord Harwick stared at the open ledger, his face draining of color before rapidly flushing with rage. Beside him, Lord Cedric looked genuinely bewildered. He had only wanted the Caldwell lands. He knew nothing of Harwick's deeper treachery against the crown. Madness, Harwick sputtered, recovering his composure with the practiced ease of a career politician. He looked up at the king's dais. My king, this is exactly the instability I spoke of. The girl has stolen council property and scribbled delusions into it. Guards, remove her. 2 armored guards stepped forward, but before their boots could hit the second flagstone, Ronin raised a single, gloved hand. The guards froze instantly. The Omega has made a formal accusation of treason against the throne, Ronin said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the vast hall like a blade drawn from a velvet sheath. He leaned back in his throne, his winter-blue eyes fixed on Harwick. Under Ashenvale law, she is permitted to present her proof. Proceed, Ivy. Harwick's hands clenched into fists. Cedric, realizing the danger of the shifting tide, took a threatening step toward Ivy. Shut your mouth, you foolish girl! You are embarrassing my name! Ivy did not even look at the man who was supposed to be her husband. She kept one hand on the smooth window ledge stone, weighing down the ledger, and used her bandaged hand to trace a line of ink on the parchment. 3 years ago, the western border reported a blight that destroyed half the winter harvest, Ivy said, her voice projecting clearly to every elder in the room. The Crown authorized emergency funds to compensate the holding, but the Western steward never received the gold. The ledger shows it was routed through a proxy account, an account authorized by this specific signature. She pointed to the bottom of the page. The standard clerk notation for a proxy transfer is a single dated INI, but this deed and the 2 forged marriage transfers Cedric used to steal previous lands before mine bear a very specific flourish, a double loop on the letter H. The elders began to whisper. A military commander seated to the left leaned over to look at the document, his brow furrowing. She is a liar, Harwick roared. The polite veneer shattered completely. He slammed his hands onto the table, his eyes flashing the terrifying gold of an enraged alpha. He released his dominance, a suffocating wave of alpha command designed to force weaker wolves straight to the ground. Kneel, Omega, Harwick bellowed, the sound vibrating in the rafters. Across the room, several beta guards flinched. Cedric himself took a step back, ducking his head instinctively against the overwhelming pressure of the elder's aura. Ivy stood perfectly still. The alpha command washed over her, heavy and thick, but it found no wolf inside her to submit. The very absence that had made her a pariah in her father's house, the emptiness that Cedric had mocked, now acted as an impenetrable shield of solid iron. She did not tremble. She did not bend. She simply looked at Harwick with clinical, chilling observation. My knees do not bend to bad math, Lord Harwick, Ivy said quietly. And they certainly do not bend to treason. A shockwave of disbelief hit the council. An unmarked, wolfless girl had just absorbed a direct command from a high elder and dismissed it like a mild draft. Up on the dais, Ronin's chest heaved once. A raw, feral surge of pride tore through his veins. His mate. She was magnificent. Harwick's humiliation boiled over into blind panic. Seeing the military commander reaching for the ledger, Harwick lunged across the table, his hand hooking into claws, desperate to tear the parchment to shreds before the proof could be verified. Ivy braced herself, refusing to step back and abandon the ledger. She never had to. Before Harwick's fingers could even graze the parchment, the air in the room seemed to crack in half. A shadow dropped between them with terrifying speed. Ronin had not walked down the stairs of the dais. He had moved with the lethal, blurring speed of a royal lichen. Suddenly, the Alpha King was standing directly in front of Ivy, shielding her completely with his broad-shouldered frame. His hand shot out, catching Harwick by the throat in midair. The momentum of the elder's lunge was stopped dead, his feet leaving the floor as Ronin held him suspended over the council table. The only sound in the vast council chamber was the desperate rasp of Harwick's breath. Ronin held the elder suspended by the throat, his winter-blue eyes practically glowing with alpha fury. He did not tighten his grip to kill. He did not need to. The sheer weight of his presence was enough to press every other wolf in the room perfectly still. "You forget yourself in my hall," Ronin whispered, the sound carrying effortlessly in the dead silence. With a flick of his wrist, Ronin tossed Harwick aside. The elder crashed onto the stone floor, gasping and clutching his chest, the heavy fur mantle tangling around his limbs like a net. Ronin did not look at him again. He turned his attention to the military commander who had stepped forward earlier. "Commander Vance, examine the ledger." Vance stepped up to the table, giving a deep, respectful bow to Ivy before he took the heavy book. He studied the ink, flipping through the pages Ivy had marked with precise notations. The silence stretched for a long, agonizing minute. Finally, Commander Vance closed the ledger. He looked at Harwick on the floor, his expression filled with absolute disgust, then looked up at the king. "The Omega speaks the truth, my king," Vance declared loudly. "The proxy seal is forged. The gold was routed directly into a private trust bearing the crest of House Harwick. The pattern matches the land seizures from 3 other border families." Panic erupted among Cedric's retainers, but a single low growl from Ronin silenced the room instantly. Ronin stood tall, the absolute sovereign of Ashenvale, and delivered his judgment without raising his voice. "Lord Harwick," Ronin said, the words falling like iron anvils, "you are stripped of your seat on the Alpha Council. You are stripped of your titles, your lands, and our rank. You will be remanded to the military tribunal for treason against the crown, and your assets will be seized to repay the borders you starved." Guards stepped forward immediately, hauling the trembling elder to his feet and dragging him toward the heavy iron doors. Harwick offered no defense. The truth was too absolute, meticulously laid bare by the woman he had dismissed as a piece of furniture. Ronin then turned his gaze to Cedric, who was physically shrinking back toward the wall. "Lord Cedric," the king continued, his tone turning to pure ice, "your marriage to this woman is annulled by royal decree. It was built on fraud and executed through corruption. You hold no claim to her, nor to the Caldwell lands. You will return to your territory and await the crown's auditors. If a single coin is missing from your accounts, you will join Harwick in the cells." Cedric bowed his head hastily, his face pale with terror. Yes, my king. Of course, my king. He scrambled out of the chamber, not looking back once at the bride he had intended to lock away. The elders who remained at the table slowly, uniformly, stood up and bowed their heads. It was a gesture of submission to the king's justice. But as they stayed bowed, it was clear the respect was equally directed at the woman standing behind the table. The pack had learned her worth. Ivy stood quietly. She felt no sudden rush of triumph, no overwhelming joy. She simply felt a clean, quiet clarity. The heavy chain of conditional value that had wrapped around her entire life had finally shattered. Ronin turned to face her. The terrifying alpha aura that had filled the room vanished, retracting completely as he looked down into her hazel eyes. The space between them felt entirely private, despite the remaining elders standing silently in the periphery. "The Caldwell lands are restored to your name," Ronin said softly. "You are no longer a prisoner, Ivy. You have your family's estate. You are free to return home." Ivy's breath hitched slightly. The words were a gift, the ultimate restoration of her dignity. Yet the thought of leaving the keep, of leaving the man who had just stood between her and the wrath of a high elder without a second thought, caused a strange, sharp ache in her chest. She looked down at the smooth window-ledge stone resting on the table. "I see," she murmured. Ronin took a slow step closer, closing the distance between them until he could smell the faint, comforting scent of pine and mint that belonged only to her. "You are free to go," Ronin repeated, his voice dropping into a low, intimate rumble that vibrated through her bones. "Unless the warmth you built in the Eastern Tower is something you intend to keep." Ivy looked at the Alpha King. The vast council chamber around them seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the quiet, charged space between them. "The Caldwell holding is my past, my king," Ivy said, softly. Her fingers brushed over the smooth, window-ledge stone she had used to weigh down the evidence. "But the Eastern Tower, I built that fire myself. It would be a shame to let it go out now." A slow, breathtaking smile broke across Ronin's face. It was a rare expression, one that softened the harsh, battle-worn lines of his features and made the winter blue of his eyes burn with intense warmth. He did not pull her into a desperate embrace. He did not claim her with a roar to the pack. Instead, Ronin reached out and took the heavy ledger from her hands, carrying the weight she had borne alone for weeks. "Then you will stay," Ronin said, his voice a deep, resonant vow. "But you will not stay as a guest, Ivy, and you will not stay in the shadows." He turned back to the massive circular oak table. With a deliberate, powerful movement, Ronin pulled out the heavy wooden chair that had once belonged to Lord Harwick, the seat of the highest elder. He looked back at Ivy, holding her gaze with absolute respect. "A pack is not led by fangs and claws alone," Ronin said, projecting his voice so the remaining elders could hear clearly. "It is led by truth, by intellect, by those who do not break when the winter comes." He gestured to the empty chair. "I do not offer you a decorative crown, Ivy. I offer you a seat at this table. You will be my Luna, my mate, and my equal. Your mind will guide this pack just as surely as my strength defends it." The elders watched in stunned silence. A wolfless Omega was being offered the highest administrative seat in Ashenvale. But after witnessing her dismantle their greatest internal threat with nothing but ink and a smooth stone. Not a single man dared to object. Ivy looked at the chair, then at the king who stood beside it. He was not giving her power. He was simply recognizing the power she already possessed. She walked forward. She set her smooth stone down on the polished wood in front of the chair. It landed with a soft, final clack. "I accept," she said. Winter passed, and the heavy snow surrounding Ashenvale Keep began to melt into the vibrant green of spring. The eastern wing was no longer abandoned. The corridor that had once been freezing and desolate was now lined with thick, warm tapestries and glowing braziers. Pack members, from military commanders to simple scribes, frequently walked down that hall, carrying ledgers, seeking counsel, and asking for the Luna's wisdom. Ivy's room, the one meant to be her icy prison, had been expanded. The hearth roared day and night. The broken window had been replaced with thick stained glass that caught the morning sun. The large wooden desk in the center of the room was covered in maps, trade agreements, and meticulously organized ledgers, all held down by smooth river stones. Ronin stood in the doorway, leaning against the heavy oak frame, watching her woo. He wore his simple dark tunic, his alpha aura completely at peace. The mate bond between them was a steady, unbreakable hum in his chest, anchoring his fierce wolf to her quiet, brilliant mind. Ivy looked up from a parchment, her hazel eyes catching the firelight. She smiled, setting her quill down. She had arrived in Ashenvale in a torn dress, treated as disposable furniture, condemned to the coldest room in the keep. But she had refused to freeze. She had refused to break. By building her own warmth, the wolfless Omega had not only saved the Alpha King, she had become the undeniable heart of the entire pack. A crown can be stolen, but true dignity cannot be buried forever. Which moment proved to you that Ivy was the true Queen of Ashenvale, long before she was offered the title? If you love emotional Alpha King stories about rejected mates, quiet strength, and women who rebuild their worlds stone by stone, subscribe and stay with us for the next